The presenter died unexpectedly but peacefully yesterday. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 80 points at 75.64. The pound buys $1.23 and €1.13. LBC weather, heavy outbreaks of rain across western and southern areas tonight. A breezy and rather mild night and lows of 5 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question on LBC. I'm Iain Dale. Let me tell you who's on my panel this evening. To my left, Anne Longfield, Chair of the Commission on Young Lives, former Children's Commissioner for England. Next to her, it's Richard Holden, Conservative Roads Minister and MP for North West Durham. To my right, Daisy Cooper, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats and MP for St Albans. And to her right, Anita Boateng, political commentator and a former advisor to Conservative Cabinet Ministers who now works for the PR agency Portland Communications. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel is 0345 6060 973. Lots of topics that you could ask about, possibly the government's plans to move asylum seekers to disused former military bases, public satisfaction with the NHS hitting an all-time low, which we've just been talking about, Sadiq Khan's claim that Nazi sympathisers have latched on to anti-ULEZ protests, and Elon Musk's call to halt building powerful AI systems before they outsmart and replace us. Surely that couldn't happen, could it? So 0345 6060 973. We've cleared the board, so if you phone now, you will get through. And of course, you can text your question to 84850 and say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's start with the text question. It relates to the last hour that we've been talking about the NHS. It's from Mary in Barnes. She says, are you satisfied with the NHS? Apparently only 29% of us are. 51% are firmly dissatisfied. Daisy Cooper.
Do you know what? I meet a lot of GPs. I meet a lot of frontline nurses and doctors, being the health spokesperson for my party. And what strikes me is that every single person working on the front line is incredibly proud to work for the NHS. And when patients get to see somebody face to face and they get the treatment that they need, they also say how brilliant the staff are. But it's unbelievably clear, it's crystal clear, that the Conservatives have been running the health service into the ground for a very long time, and that people are struggling to see a GP when they need to see one. They're struggling for an ambulance to arrive when they call one. So I think overall, I'm not at all surprised that people aren't satisfied with the NHS, because it seems to be crumbling at the seams.
Is that me?
Whose phone was that?
That's probably me.
That wasn't me.
It's a division bell, isn't it?
Division bell.
That doesn't mean to say you're leaving.
No, it's the House of Lords, it's fine.
Thank goodness for that. Well, if you switch it off, Richard, that would be appreciated.
Apologise for that.
Cutting Daisy off in her stride. How have things changed there? Because in the last hour we had, I think there were 2 points that people made. That a couple of callers were saying, look, the Conservatives are doing this deliberately because they want to privatise the NHS. And then there was 2 other people who said that the basic problem in the NHS, and one of them was an NHS consultant, too many administrators, and too much money is going on administration and not enough on direct patient care. Do you have any sympathy with that?
So what's interesting is that quite a lot of frontline doctors and nurses say to me that they actually want more administrators, because if you have fewer of them...
Seriously?
Well, because if you have fewer of them, then you end up with the clinical staff who are very professionally trained actually filling in the forms. What we're seeing in the NHS is there is a huge bureaucracy backlog. It is crazy that there are 60 or 70 different IT systems being used. There's horrific horror stories of, one nurse said that she had to take a pregnant woman from the maternity ward. She had a complication, had to take her to another ward, but had to carry a pile of paper, several inches thick from one department to another because the 2 different IT systems didn't speak to each other. So if you could invest in clearing this kind of bureaucracy backlog of all these IT systems that don't speak to each other, you could actually make the workforce far more productive.
But that's not a political problem, is it? That is an administrative problem within the NHS. You can't blame politicians for that.
It is a political problem because actually things like digital and tech come from the same capital budget as the money to fix hospitals. And because the Conservatives have not invested in fixing hospitals for a very long time, we know that there are hospital roofs that are going to fall down in many hospitals around the country. We know that many hospital buildings, including some in my own area in West Hertfordshire, are life expired. If all the money now has to go on building new hospitals, that's fewer money. There's less money to pay for the tech that we need to actually make the workforce more productive. So again, it's a political problem of not investing in the things that we need to happen in the NHS soon enough. And as I say, the Tories have been running the service into the ground for years and years and years. It's all come to a terrible crunch point, and the patients are really feeling the pain.
Richard Holden, your constituency is presumably very different to Daisy's, but do you have similar complaints from people?
Particular concerns around mental health service, actually. That's one of the issues I get a lot of, and that's for children and young people and all the way up, actually. That's we've had a real issue with Tees Esconway Valley Mental Health Trust over the last few years. There's some important reports going on at the moment and looking into them. I think they're a bit of an outlier on that, but I think it speaks to a broader issue around mental health across the country, and it's something that the government's taking seriously and started to invest in. I think moving in the right direction, probably not all the way there yet on mental health services, but more broadly, everybody around this panel, we could all bandy numbers around, but the truth is we're spending more than ever before in the NHS in real terms. It's a huge, if you look at over the last sort of 30, 40 years, the percentage of the amount of money the nation has spent on the NHS gone up from around 3.5% to 10%. It's a huge amount of cash that taxpayers are now putting in, but that's also rising in line with demand. We've got an ageing population and also better outcomes for people. There's once upon a time, a lot of younger children wouldn't have survived as they do today, and at the top end we're really expanding life expectancy for people as well. But there are issues there, and one of the issues we've been really trying
life expectancy is going down.
I think it's over the last few decades it's gone into
but over the last couple of years it's actually started to reduce. I think
it's become more static now over the last few years. But I think the point I wanted to really make over the moment is the government's trying to address one of the big issues at the moment, which is around doctors. And I've had this issue in my own constituency. I've had GPs in their late 40s, early 50s saying they'll only work 3 days a week because of the pension arrangements. And I think also at people leaving the profession because of those pension arrangements too. And we could see the Royal College of Surgeons.
But it's worse than that, isn't it? Because we heard from Colin Mohammed, who's a consultant in the last hour. He's been in the NHS for 20 years. He's leaving. He said 6 of his colleagues that he knows personally are leaving in the next 6 months. They're going to Canada, Australia or New Zealand. Now, this is becoming it's like the brain drain in the 1970s, isn't it? What's being done to address that?
Well, one of the big things we're doing to address it is around these pension arrangements, which have been particularly...
But that only affects like 100 or 200 consultants.
No, it doesn't. It affects tens of thousands of doctors across the... I was in the House of the Statement today on the second reading of the Finance Bill. This affects tens of thousands of senior doctors across the country, and it's either got them reducing their hours or switching to private sector work, or indeed, as you've just mentioned, going abroad to do work. I think it's one of the big changes in the budget, and I hope that everybody should be able to welcome it. It was something that Wes Streeting from the Shadow Health Minister said we should do just a few months ago, and I think it'll hopefully mark a sea change. I think there's other stuff we can do in that as well, which we need to go further on, but I think it's a massive step in the right direction. Around half the people affected by that pension change are just doctors, and I think that's one of the big changes that we've seen, and the government's determined to tackle waiting lists and to ensure that patients can get seen, because we do have a backlog from COVID, and I want to see it come down for
that backlog has been there for way longer than the pandemic. It was there before the pandemic, and as well as everybody else knows.
There was a backlog, but it wasn't
nowhere near as high days, was it?
Sure, but even
it's
still,
like doubled, hasn't it?
I think what you'll see is that actually the numbers of staff that are leaving are not just saying it's about pensions. What they're saying doing it because they're overworked and they're underpaid. And that's why we've seen all these strikes going on for months and months and months.
But on the other hand, we had a midwife who texted it, or the sister of a midwife who said, my sister, she now only works 2 shifts a week in the NHS, and they offer her more, but she doesn't take them because she can get more money working in the private sector. And everyone in the NHS knows that this is happening, and nobody does anything about it. And yet the midwives are the first to complain that they're under-resourced.
But this is a massive problem. And actually, if you look at some of the data, Richard said, the government spending lots of money on the NHS and spending more. But actually, what you can see is that a lot of money is being spent on agency staff because the NHS aren't actually able to retain the staff working for the NHS in salary positions. And part of that is because the NHS isn't a flexible employer. And it's also because of the terms and conditions.
Should we let our other 2 panellists have a go? Anne?
Yeah, so obviously my starting point is I've had some brilliant experiences with the NHS. My family has. There's brilliant people, but I am dissatisfied with the system because I just find it so frustrating. And the work that I've done around the NHS just bamboozles you with systems and structures that change very often, and everyone's always trying to get to a new place and a new reform, and what that seems to do is constantly distract from the central point that actually we need to get ahead. We can't just have the most effective, of course we want the most effective treatment, but we can't just have that. We need to get ahead. We need to enable people to stay well. We need to invest in children, in families, in people before they get to the point where they need crisis intervention. And what I've seen, I was glad you mentioned that around mental health, because obviously I've seen a lot of that with kids absolutely buckling with demand. I mean, it's about 6 years ago now that some kids came to me and said, we know we can't get treatment until we try to kill ourselves. Sadly, they're still saying that. I thought we'd moved on from that, but they're still saying that.
There's
and
a tragic
that even
case.
Is not
I was
enough.
Watching the lunchtime news. There's a tragic case in Kent of a 25-year-old who couldn't get the access to mental health services, so just didn't respond to any calls at all. And after 3 weeks, he took his own life.
Sadly, it's not uncommon. And at the heart of that is people get lost in the system. At the heart of that is that, a lot of people, when they're at their most vulnerable, won't be able to stay in touch. They need services to come to them. They need help to be on their terms, not on the terms of the kind of system, if you like. And we need to get to the point where it's stable enough as a system to be able to start putting those really important reforms in place, which are around people and around places and around long-term outcomes which make people better. And of course, there's brilliant work going on some of that, but there's too many people fall through those gaps.
Anita?
Well, I think that we are definitely, as a country, very committed to the NHS. And actually, most of the stuff I hear anecdotally in my experience has been broadly positive. But one of the things that's apparent from this conversation is just how complicated it is, just how many systems are required to make it work better. And actually, that the shape of demand has changed profoundly over the past couple of years. That includes COVID, which accelerated some of those trends, like mental health concerns. And also, we talked about the demographic changes, which are really, really important. And I guess the frustration I have is that we continually talk about we create the sense that there isn't political will to deliver an NHS that really works for people. And I think it does a disservice to politics when we suggest, for instance, that the Conservatives have some kind of conspiracy to damage the NHS when actually the Conservatives have put record amounts in. And there is a real desire to make the NHS work better for people, to retain doctors and nurses, and to ensure that we are tackling some of the challenges that mean children don't get the best start in life or can't get help when they need mental health support, or older people or cancer patients, and all of that. I think there's enormous goodwill, and what it's going to require is everyone having a series of grown-up conversations about the things that we need to reform, because absolutely the demands on the NHS are not going anywhere.
But we've been having these debates for 20 years
Absolutely.
And nothing changes.
But I think what we need to start with is less of actually it was the Conservatives that weren't doing this or that or the other, because actually I do think that the demands have really changed, and we can't pretend there are easy solutions to these really, really complicated problems.
Right, we will take more of your questions on completely different subjects in just a moment. Just to remind also at 9, we're going to solve the Cyprus crisis. A few years ago, we did the LBC Middle East peace process. We got Mark Regev, who was then Israeli ambassador to London, and the Palestinian ambassador in the studio. And, well, obviously it hasn't solved the crisis, but we're going to do the same. We're going to have the Cypriot ambassador to the UK joining us, and the leader of the Turkish Cypriot community, who is called president of Northern Cyprus. And I think this is going to be quite an interesting one. So if you are from the Greek Cypriot community or the Turkish Cypriot community, you are going to want to listen to this at 9 and hopefully phone in and give us your views as well. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
In the studio, Anne Longfield, chair of the Commission on Young Lives. I guess it does what it says on the tin.
It does.
But what do you spend your day doing?
Well, after I was Children's Commissioner, the kids I was most worried about were the teenagers most at risk. So I set up a piece of work that looked at research at that and came up with solutions of what we should do about that. So really, you've got a group of teenagers that are often falling through the cracks, not getting the help they need, at danger of becoming involved in exploitation or crime. And actually, if they could get the support they need, they would be able to have, obviously, a much more fulfilling life. But, it's there to be able to have, as far as I can see, but we need to want to do it.
Richard Holden is here, Conservative Transport Minister. You have responsibility for roads. Is that the short straw in the departmental portfolios? Or
I don't think so. I love my roads and local transport. Do buses. Sometimes they let me go to see a tram as well. So there's all sorts of things. Well, coaches as well. Big, particularly important for young people in intercity travel. Actually, no, it's a lovely portfolio to have because it's quite diverse. You've got some of that immediate pressures on things around the bus sector trying to recover still from COVID. We've still got a third of concessionary fare travellers, so that's particularly people of retirement age plus not travelling as frequently as they were, so putting real pressures on the system. But on the other side, we've got the big capital projects around roads as well, so there's two different sides to it.
And can you stop the Highways Agency closing the A11 on a Friday night?
Well, you've already been lobbying me about this, so I'm determined to, as soon as when I see the Chief Executive of the Highways Agency next time, National Highways, I will raise it particularly with him.
Fantastic.
To try and make things better in the east of England.
See, this is modern day political sleaze, isn't it? Me abusing my position. Daisy Cooper is with us, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, and Anita Boateng from Portland Communications. Now, let's go to another caller. It's Shuvik in Eltham. Hello, Shuvik.
Hello, Ian, and hello to the panel. My question is, should the Rwanda policy be dropped, and where would the panel house refugees already in the country?
Anita, let's start with you.
I don't think it should be dropped. I think that at this point, who knows whether and when there will be permission for it to proceed. Because I do think that you need to have a system. We all want a system that allows refugees to come to this country when they're needed. But we all straightforwardly know that we cannot house absolutely every single person who would quite like to or prefer to base themselves in the UK for even as they're fleeing war-torn countries, just because infrastructurally we just do not have the capacity to do that. So we have to have a system of deciding who can come and who can't, and that's going to necessarily be a bit messy and be a bit arbitrary. And so when you've got a system like that, what really, really matters is that you have some way of making those kinds of decisions. And what we're seeing from the small boats in particular is a massive shift, a fundamental shift in the ways in which all of Europe has been impacted by the volumes of people coming over. And no country has got this right. Like, you look at Italy, you look at Germany, France.
No excuse for us to get it wrong, though.
No, but my point is that it's complicated, and no country has managed to successfully attack the problem as it exists right now, which is that it is breaking asylum systems as they exist. And so you have to explore options that are not the usual, because I think there has been a fundamental shift in the kinds of volumes that we're seeing.
But surely...
And it's really destroying lives, just to say, particularly because of the exploitation that we are seeing of people who are incredibly vulnerable.
The only point of the policy, though, surely is to deter people from coming in the first place. But if only a couple of hundred people are ever going to be sent to Rwanda each year, that's not exactly a great deterrent, is it?
Yeah, I think that the point about whether this is going to be effective is something that absolutely needs to be proven. But I don't think there's a reason just not to explore it at all, to see if it actually does help break this system. Because fundamentally, if you end up in a situation where the likelihood of these traffickers getting the money they want is significantly impacted by the fact that actually they can't successfully locate themselves in the UK, that could break the system. I think actually the thing that matters more than this, and I slightly get frustrated that Rwanda is a bit of a distraction from the fundamental issue of returning, because you have to get to a system where if someone has an asylum claim that is declined, there is a way to remove them from the country, and that requires agreement with those countries. We've seen this with Albania, where a deal went in, and then the numbers of Albanians coming into the country via small boats dramatically changed. And I think that is the focus, and that is what's going to deliver results. I slightly feel that Rwanda is a distraction, but there's no reason not to explore that as an option.
Daisy Cooper.
Yes, I do think that the Rwanda scheme should be scrapped. I think it is immoral. I think it is unworkable, and I think it is incredibly expensive for the taxpayer. What Liberal Democrats have said time and time again is that instead we would prefer to see safe and legal routes established, so that people who are genuinely fleeing war and persecution have a way of getting to their country to make their claim in a safe way, and that the money that you would save from scrapping the Rwanda scheme should be spent on processing the thousands and thousands and thousands of claims claims that are now ticking up at the Home Office. And through doing that, you would make sure that people who desperately need help can access it. They can start their lives here. They can get jobs. They can start to pay tax. And those people who don't have a legitimate claim can be deported swiftly. And that's a solution that we put to the government. And sadly, they've just ignored it.
Why have you ignored it, Richard Holden?
Well, I think, first of all, I just take Daisy's point there head on. I don't think it's immoral at all to send people to another safe country. I mean, they're fleeing from a safe country, i.e. France or Belgium in the first place. And I'd just like to, just drill down a little bit into what Daisy was saying there. We've got two sorts of people crossing, coming into the country at the moment. We've got a huge number of economic migrants, and we've also got genuine refugees. We've had schemes for genuine refugees from Ukraine, from Syria, from Afghanistan, and elsewhere, and particularly Hong Kong as well. Over 100,000 people arriving from Hong Kong too over the last couple of years. Those are clear, safe and legal routes. As you mentioned with the Albanian situation, we've seen huge numbers of people deciding to come to the UK, even though they're already either in a safe country and can claim refugee status there, or have no issue at all and are trying to basically bypass the normal system where normal economic migrants have to go through to get to the UK. And I think it's basic fairness actually for people, that what they want to see is that people who want to be an economic migrant to the UK have to go to the same system as everybody else. And I don't understand why there's been such a pushback on that. The real expense in this system is the fact that people have been coming across in huge numbers in recent years, and we've had to try and house them as we see an exponential almost increase in the numbers coming, and we have to have some deterrence there. And one of those sensible deterrents, I think, is Rwanda policy. The other is what.
But it's not a deterrent, as I just explained. If you're only sending 200 people there, people have a sort of. I don't know, 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 chance of avoiding it.
And the other is what Anita said, which is actually the bigger picture as well, which is for many of them from safe countries coming. For example, the third of people who came last year, the third of all of the migrants who came across the Channel were from Albania, a safe country, a NATO ally, and we need to get them deported as swiftly as possible. And I'm glad that return agreements are there.
If Rwanda is such a safe country, why do we accept asylum seekers from Rwanda?
I think the truth is, when it looks to, you look at Rwanda and the system at the moment, well, you could say the same with Albania until relatively recently as well. I think it's a matter of getting agreements in place and certain legislation passed. But nobody's arguing that Albania is not a safe country, and I don't think realistically anybody's actually today arguing that Rwanda isn't a safe country either. I think what we need to do is have a system which basically stops the boats, because the truth is that people are dying in the Channel trying to get here from other safe countries. If we can stop the boats and give people confidence in our system again, I think people are happy to see sensible economic migration policy. Over the last few years, that's what we've tried to move to, not the open door policy we had when we were members of the European Union, and also those routes for genuine refugees. I've got Syrian people who've been resettled in my own constituency, Ukrainians and Hong Kongers too. And I think people are happy to see those routes. What they don't want to see is that you get here, you can stay here if you manage to make it all the way. The British government had a really sensible policy with Syria, which is to take the most vulnerable from refugee camps. And I think that's exactly what we should be doing, going out to help those most in need around the world, not those who've got the ability to make their way here.
So my answer is yes, of course it should be scrapped, as should the idea that we're looking at barges and cruise ships and
why should that be scrapped?
Well, I just think it's just, it's like a headline looking for a policy, really. We're talking about very small numbers, 2,000 or 3,000, whereas actually I think we're looking at more like 45,000, 50,000 needed. So, and already there's been, it started to crumble today, mainly because of Conservative MPs who are saying this, it's not good governance, it's too expensive, it won't happen, all of those sort of things. But
So you're happy for the taxpayer to pay £7 million a day?
Well, no, because I think that's completely unsustainable. And
okay, well, so what's your alternative?
No, absolutely. So I guess I think what we have to do is start running this system properly so we speed up. One question I can't answer is why the backlogs are so huge. You know, it's taking so long for people to go through this system. And I spent time when there was the Calais camps a few years ago. The only way that moved was when there were proper partnerships with France that could actually make it work on proper safe routes that would enable
you've
people
dodged my
to move.
question. If you don't want people to be put up in hotels, if you don't want them to be put up in RAF bases or on barges or on ferries, where do you want them to be put up?
Well, I suppose there has to be somewhere where people go in the short term, and I don't want them to be in the hotels because I know this is
What's wrong with barges or military camps then?
Well, it's your colleagues that are talking about it.
I think there's individual constituency MPs will obviously raise concerns about local issues, but generally on the policy, I just don't think
it's sustainable because you're talking about 3,000 places and we've got 45,000.
You'll have more than that, but what's your issue with barges and hotels?
Well, it would be hordes of people hordes of barges that we're talking about. I just don't think it's workable.
If it's cheaper than hotels, what's wrong with that?
Because I think the actual emphasis needs to be on a policy that works. And a policy that works for long term.
That's all warm words, but
really. I think the barges are taking up an awful lot of warm words, whereas actually we should be focusing on.
We have 400 hotels at the moment across this country. I don't know if they're anywhere you live, but there are in constituencies across the country.
I understand that.
Well, where would you?
But
put
I
these
wouldn't
people?
have got. Well, if
you wouldn't have got here. Okay.
No. All right. Let me go to the kids that are in the hotels as well, because there's been horror stories of kids that have gone missing from Brighton, 200 kids at a time, put into hotels.
Let's put them somewhere secure.
So you move them quickly to the places where they've got long-term places to be. For children, that's because local authorities have a duty to be able to look after them.
We all know.
So don't put them into hotels in the first place. And actually, if they go missing, can you notice?
So where would you put them?
Well, there's a statutory duty for local authorities to actually look after children.
But everybody. So you just disperse them across the country, wherever, i.e. in the hotels, which is exactly the problem.
No, not in the hotels at all. They have a duty to look after them through their care system.
Let's take the pressure off Anne for a second, because neither of you actually...
You can't put tens of thousands of people through it.
Neither of you said where you would put them either.
Well, as I said, if you scrap the Rwanda scheme, you could use that money to actually invest in the processing of all these various claims.
No, you're not answering my question. If you don't want them in hotels, if you don't want them in barges, if you don't want them at RAF bases, where would you put them?
So
we're dealing with the problem as it is now, not how you would like it to be.
The problem that the Conservatives have made is simply that there are no good answers on this, and it's for the government to bring forward solutions. But I think
it's also for you too. If you want people to vote for you, they want to know what you think.
Well, as I say, if people want to vote for the Liberal Democrats, they're going to be voting for a policy where we would scrap the Rwanda scheme and we would spend that money on processing all the various claims.
And where do you put them in the meantime?
Well, again, as I just said, there is no good solution to this.
We'll come up with one that isn't good then, because you haven't come up with a single one so far.
Well, it's for the government to bring this forward, because it's
that is abdicating responsibility. How you can sit there as somebody who presumably aspires to be in government at some time and not say what you would do if you were in that position.
I have literally just told you what I would do.
No, you haven't. You can't just say, I wouldn't have started from here.
That isn't what I said. What I said was, given the situation that we have today, we would scrap the scheme the Conservatives have come up with, which is sending people to be processed in Rwanda, which we know isn't going to work.
And the 40,000 people who are in hotels at the moment, you'd leave them there?
Well, you would invest in processing the claims. Now, there might be other suggestions.
You can't just bring in 10,000 new people to process the claims overnight, can you?
I'm not in the government. I don't have the civil service giving me suggestions of all the different places that people could go. What I'm saying is we would scrap this particular scheme. We would spend the money on processing the claims of people who have already got a claim in place to speed that up. We have to have safe.
You don't think the government are trying to do that?
No, I don't think they're doing it. They're spending all this money. They're spending all this money on the Rwanda scheme, and that is money that could be spent on speeding up the processing.
Anita?
I think
neither does the government. Come on.
We've just come up with it.
No, Anita.
I mean,
so have all of your
backbenchers. Really,
I just think that grown-up politics requires us engaging in the situation.
Last night's panel was troublesome.
Saying, "Well, I wouldn't have started here," and I think that is not what we need from politicians right now, because
Literally
we all accept it's complicated. But
actually, not what I said.
Okay. On the question, I think that the reality of the situation is that we can't house them anywhere else, and it becomes a very a nightmarish logistical problem. But actually, one of the things that Robert Jenrick also announced today, which I'm not sure was covered as much, was money invested in the Afghan settlement scheme to get more long-term housing, basically for people that had been here 18 months. And it would appeal to for children as well, because obviously schooling is a big thing that's massively impacted, and also more money for local authorities that are dealing with this. So I think you've got to have a twin track of this. By the way, on these barges, I mean, the Netherlands have done this and done it fairly successfully, had 1,500 people in these
They probably have a lot more barges than we do.
And also in Edinburgh, in Scotland. Scotland also.
Yeah, Scotland has ferries. That is. Listen,
I mean, and they were
5
the
minutes late.
Ukrainian refugees were held in the Glasgow.
Richard, we're 5 minutes late to the news, and I did this last night, and I had Alexander and David Davis and Shola to deal with. Right, let's go to the news headlines at 8:35. Here's Daryl Jackson.
Some of the Conservative Party's own MPs are criticising plans to house asylum seekers in disused military bases while their claims are processed. The Immigration Minister says it will bring down hotel bills currently paid by the taxpayer. Pope Francis is experiencing difficulty breathing and is going into hospital for several days. The 86-year-old will be treated for an infection. And the King has begun the first state visit of his reign. The Queen Consort is alongside him as they spend the first of 3 days in Germany. LBC weather, heavy outbreaks of rain across western and southern areas tonight. A breezy and rather mild night with lows of 5.
LBC.
Right, everyone's calmed down now. We have Anne Longfield, Richard Holden, Daisy Cooper and Anita Boateng with us. Let's go to Robert in Leighton. Hello, Robert.
Hello, everyone. 27% of primary school children leave school and they haven't reached an adequate standard in reading. How should this serious challenge be addressed?
You see, this is a question that could have been asked any time in the last 15 years. I am turning this way because you're the children expert on the panel, so I'm going to come to you first, Anne.
I mean, look at that figure, though, 27%. I mean, That is a shocking
And that's 27%
figure.
at the age of 16, 18, or after primary school?
I think the question was. Point was.
It's probably still around the same at 16.
Absolutely. So the shocking figure at 16 is that 20% of kids leave at 16 without the basic levels of qualifications. So after £100,000 after 14 years, they don't come out without those basic qualifications, sometimes not enough to get onto an apprenticeship course. You know, the absolute basics. And obviously those kids are much more likely to be the poor kids, the kids with special educational needs, the kids who have got vulnerable families at home, find it difficult to study at home, all of those things. And actually, one thing to say with that is that 40% of that disadvantage gap you'll find at 16 actually is in place by the time they start school at the beginning. So those are all even
That's the most horrifying statistic,
depressing things that I've got to tell you. Yeah, exactly.
They just don't stand a chance.
So the thing is, we know this. So knowing it, in my world, means that we have to really do something about it. We know where to start. We've got the clues. Tackle early years so that kids bounce into school, especially those that are the most disadvantaged. You know, if you think you've got homes where children are learning thousands of words, a day by the time they're 2, and then others where they're not, but actually got to really look at enabling those kids that have the highest mountain to climb to get that bounce into school. And once they're in school, put the support in place, which is ambitious for every one of those children. And the schools that I see that do it really well, and are really inclusive, almost have a scaffolding in place, not in a kind of intrusive way, but a scaffolding in place around those kids, around those families, to help them make the most of that opportunity.
So if those schools do it really well, why can't the schools that don't do it really well learn from those schools?
Well, of course. So there's an awful lot of incentives in the system that take schools away from doing that. Let's look at Ofsted, being a bit in the news at the moment.
Indeed.
Well, actually, the main feature of Ofsted, it's widened, but key feature of Ofsted is around looking at grades and academic achievement. Now, that's been a real driving incentive in a lot of schools to actually put the emphasis on those kids who are going to achieve. And I'm not trying to do schools down here at all. The emphasis on kids who are going to achieve, and actually those who aren't have found themselves sidelined often. Now, that is a changing number of schools. Fewer and fewer schools are doing that, but I would still say the majority of schools feel that that's what the system actually drives them to. They're not rewarded for helping the kids who need extra help get there. They are rewarded for getting grades. And that is a system which needs to, reset itself. It needs to be much more about ensuring that actually education is something which all kids can feel is for them. Otherwise, we're just going to get this constant increase of kids who are leaving school without the qualifications. And it's the country that will suffer as an end, because we need kids to be active citizens and driving productivity.
Anita, that all sounds completely sensible to me. Why isn't it being implemented?
Well, I think the government's actually done a great deal in terms of emphasis on literacy and numeracy, and I think that is actually one of the really important things. And of course there are other things. We want rounded kids, but in terms of addressing that fundamental issue of disadvantage, you have got to put in place a lot of an emphasis on literacy and numeracy, because I think you don't get off the board in terms of advantages in life if you can't master those basics. And I actually think, for instance, the announcement from Sunak around increasing the age at which pupils have to study literacy and numeracy, I think that's particularly important. I also think
just numeracy, actually.
Numeracy, yes, but we should also
literacy would be good as well, but no.
We should also talk about parents who have a really important role in this, in terms of helping them understand, as Anne just said, the disadvantage that can be baked in at a very young age, from which case you're struggling to catch up. And I had parents who weren't particularly from an advantaged background, but they really understood and valued the importance of education. So I may not come from a wealthy background, but that emphasis on education, on attempting to get, books in the school, or for me particularly, I'll dump you in the library, was really, really beneficial to ensuring that I was able to continue to have a really strong performance through the education system. So I think there is some stuff that schools absolutely can and should do, and I think the government's reforms, particularly around emphasising literacy and numeracy, has really helped. But I also think that issue with the parents and ensuring that they can give their kids a good start in life also is going to make a big difference.
Daisy.
Well, it's critical that we tackle this, isn't it? Because it really is about giving every child the best start in life and them having, the opportunities that they can get in life. And if you can't even, read or do maths at a very young age, then you're really, really going to struggle later on. When I meet, and I do meet regularly with head teachers of my primary schools and secondary schools in my constituency, as well as with the chairs of the governors, and one of the things they talk to me about is the fact that they are having to cut the number of teaching assistants they have in their classrooms because their school budgets don't stretch to cover them anymore. So there are fewer and fewer staff in the classroom, and of course that means that there's less contact between the children and the teachers themselves. And I think making sure that there's those funds to make sure that they can get teaching assistants is really critical. The other thing that's really clear to me in St Albans is, on average we're a fairly wealthy, leafy kind of place, but we do have pockets of real deprivation in my constituency and in other areas nearby. And what's really clear is that because
redeploy the teaching assistants from the
all of the schools
areas to the others.
All of the schools are struggling with a lack of teaching assistants, and what it means is that those children whose parents can afford to give them extra tuition will give them extra tuition, and those kids that can't don't get it. But the other issue is that some schools now can't even afford to buy the pens, the paper, the books, and actually they rely on their parent-teacher associations, the PTAs, to do that fundraising. Now, if you're from a school in a deprived area and you can't raise very much money, well, those kids are going to go without, and that's really, really inequitable.
Because we spent so long on the last question, Richard, I'm going to have to ask you to be really brief on the answer to this.
I will be really brief. Look, I've come from my constituency is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum in a lot of ways to Daisy's, but we face a lot of we face real issues, and I think there's a couple of things. I think Anne's made a really important point, which is that by the time these kids get to school, they're already massively behind and being held back. I think a lot of that is about early years and parenting. I'm glad that the government started to move in some directions on that. I think that's a really worthwhile thing to do. It's so fundamentally important. We've also seen some extra cash through education investment zones, and one of the things I'm glad about the extra money that has gone into education has been focused around pupil premium. So I do notice a difference between the schools in my constituency which have 60-70% kids on free school meals and the ones which don't. You can see a difference there in that extra funding going in. And I think some of the big reforms actually over the last 10, 11, 12 years, phonics has been a step in the right direction during those primary school years as well. But I don't think there's anybody who's going to say it's sorted at all. But I think we have seen some big shifts in the right direction. And just to raise that overall standard of schools, one thing I would say that the last Labour government did reasonably well, actually, was around schools in London and shifted them from when I was in school to, from the bottom of the league tables to moving them to the top. I think I want to see some of that genuine reforming zeal, which I think Michael Gove took through. I think it's really important we see it. But I also want to see those vocational opportunities there as well, so that we're not funneling all young people to, in some cases, not brilliant university courses which aren't actually setting them up for life either.
Right, we'll move on to another subject in just a couple of moments. It's 8:47.
LBC.
How much
We have with us Anne Longfield, Richard Holden, Daisy Cooper and Anita Boateng. James is in air. Hello, James.
Hello, Ian. Nice to talk to you again. This might not be a priority for your panel, but I'd be really interested in their answers to this. My question is, can the Labour Party win the next general election without winning back Scotland?
Very ill-timed question, James, given that we don't have a Labour representative on the panel tonight. But let's answer the question anyway. Daisy, let's start with you.
Well, I think what's clear is that the Labour Party is going to need a swing larger than the 1997 election to take power on its own. It really be for Labour to say whether or not they think they can do that. It's clear that I think they probably have to win back parts of Scotland, probably not all of Scotland, but they'll certainly need to win some seats in Scotland. But as far as the Lib Dems are concerned, my party, we're going all guns blazing to try and win as many seats as possible off the Conservatives at the next election.
And presumably off the SNP in Scotland as well.
There'll be some seats there as well, yes, of course.
Anita?
I'm not sure that they can regardless. I mean, the challenge in Scotland, we obviously have seen the challenges that the SNP have gone through with their leadership thing. I think the Chief Executive described it as a mess, and I think we can all agree it has been a mess and a bit of a disaster for the SNP. And the problems that we're going to see around unity, I think, are only going to continue. And I think that Labour obviously is going to do their best to exploit that, but fundamentally, Labour is not in shape to really, make massive gains. And we're talking about the polls say maximum 20 seats. Most projections are more like maybe they'll get 7 or 8. So I really don't think we're looking for a change in fortunes, and that's because Labour's been so complacent with Scotland for so long, and those chickens are coming home to roost. And the fact that the Conservatives, not in the last election, but
you see, if you'd given that answer 6 months ago, I'd have thought, yep, she's onto something there. Now I think you're completely out of date.
Well, I mean, I really do think that there's all to play for in Scotland, but I do fundamentally think that the idea that Labour is going to come in and sweep Scotland, I still think the SNP have a really strong foothold there, and it would take, maybe Humza Yousaf will just completely faceplant and it'll completely change, but I do think that...
Faceplant, is that an expression?
Yes, falling over on your face.
That one.
But I think...
As in planting your face.
Yeah. But I think the idea that, now that Nicola Sturgeon's gone, here we go, you'll sweep in and there's 50 seats up for grabs, I think that's quite complacent, and I think they should be complacent.
Well, I imagine this is a really live discussion, and I agree with you completely that actually I would have probably said the same 2 months ago, 3 months ago, however long it's been. But I think things have changed. I think it's completely changed in the last few weeks, and I think the next few possibly days and weeks will be very telling. But I do think there's much more confidence and bounce in the Labour people that I talk to, who are looking at what Scotland means in terms of Labour as representation. Of course, it won't necessarily be the sweep that you're looking at, but I think we are talking about a significant incremental gain that wasn't there potentially a few weeks ago.
Richard?
I think you'll see the SNP under a lot of pressure in Scotland in the next election. I think you can see back in 2017 the Tories making hay with some of those seats, particularly around Aberdeenshire and the Lowlands. I think you might see places like Ayr actually with the Conservative SNP fight. I think you'll see in Central Belt, in more Central Belt, Glasgow areas, parts of Edinburgh, and parts of Dunfermline, places like that, you'll see some of those Labour SNP fights as well. But I actually think what Daisy said was pretty telling. They're coming after, Lib Dems coming after the Conservatives, Labour coming after the Conservatives. The SNP and Conservatives are going to have really hard battles in places like Aberdeenshire and the Lowlands. I think you're going to see that's what the next election is going to shape up to, actually. I think it's going to be the Conservatives versus the rest, and that's going to be a pretty tough fight, because we're fighting on multiple different fronts right across the country.
Right, another text question. There's no name on this one. Please do leave your name when you text us. Would you like to abolish the Mayor of London and the Toothless London Assembly? Richard, let's start with you.
Well, I can understand why people might feel like that. I certainly never voted for the Mayor of London, and I can understand why people are irritated, particularly when he's expanding ULEZ right to the borders of London, which wasn't in the manifesto he was elected on. But I think the answer to that is to, rather than abolish the entire thing, because I think you can help London have a position on a global stage, and it is a world city, the capital of our country. I think the answer is to change him at the next election, and you won't have to wait too long to do that.
Is that because you are a government minister and you have to say that? Because I suspect if you were backbencher Richard Holden, I might have got a slightly different answer.
No, I don't think it was. I think I'm absolutely straight, wherever I am in the government.
Anita?
I'm a former local councillor for London, so I think that representation really does matter, and I think that the London Assembly members and the mayor do some important work, particularly around policing in London, and that's where we've seen Sadiq Khan obviously abjectly fail. I also think ULEZ is a complete disaster and really is impacting, and the low traffic neighbourhoods also just not been implemented particularly well. So yes, the solution is vote, get in a really good representative, not scrap the whole thing entirely.
Daisy?
Well, as a Liberal Democrat, I'm in favour of devolving power, and I would like to see a lot more powers devolved to local authorities all around the country. I think the Greater London Authority is a good thing that should remain. I'm very much sort of on the fence about whether positions of mayor can be a good thing or a bad thing. But what I would say in relation to London is that obviously I'm a St Albans MP. I'm from Hertfordshire. We're just on the cusp of London, and the M25 runs through my constituency. And a lot of the policies in London impact on us, but we don't have a say. And we really struggle with the fact that we don't have a devolution of power in Hertfordshire in the way that London does. And I think there's many of us on a cross-party basis who would like to see that.
Anne?
I think mayors are a good thing and I'd like more of them.
That was a very succinct answer, which means that we might be able to just squeeze
I thought
in.
you'd appreciate that.
I always appreciate brief answers. Let's squeeze in David and Ealing, but you literally each have about 30 seconds for the to give the answer. David, hello. Yes, it is a caller. Hello, David. What would you like to ask?
Hi, David. I was just wondering, Iain. I want to talk about Elon Musk and his idea that we shouldn't continue developing AI because they could get smarter than us. What are your thoughts on that, Iain?
Luckily, I don't have to give my thoughts. Daisy?
I think AI could be an enormous force for good. It probably can be a force for bad as well. And I think the key to tackling that is to have some proper regulation. I think the issue we have at the moment is that technology is evolving so quickly and so much faster than the way that any parliament in the world can act. So I would be in favour of a better, improved, faster regulatory system where these sort of new AI systems have to sort of set out what their own regulator would do, and then that regulator would have to meet certain criteria around being sort of independent and effective, so that you can, and then other people talk about sort of pre-regulation as well, where you sort of have evolving regulatory standards before they actually get codified. So I think the key for me is AI could be a fantastic thing. It could be fantastic for diagnosing people's illnesses. It could be a fantastic thing for learning, but it's got to be properly regulated.
Very briefly, Anne. Not as briefly as the last one, but nearly.
Well, I think I think it's too late to stop for a start. I think, we're way past that. But I do think we're at a moment where actually what has been something almost a sci-fi concept of what AI could be is actually falling into reality. So we've already seen that, you can go online, you can have AI writing essays, press releases,
radio scripts,
paintings, all of those things, and that feels like a huge change from where we were only a year or two ago. The regulation and getting a hold of this and making sure that all the controls we have and regulations we have and we have in our physical life is there for AI is really important. But I think we need to move quick to start getting ahead of what is already well down the tracks.
I think AI can be a force for good. I mean, we're looking at all sorts of technological changes in my department, actually, when we're looking at all the changes to what might happen with roads and self-driving cars and all that sort of thing as well. I think I pretty much agree with what a lot of others have said, and the answer is proper regulation here. And I would say that, we have seen that when it doesn't work that well. Online safety bills are a good example of that, how to bring that in because the algorithm was driving people towards, the more of the same thing, things like suicide. We just need to be very careful about that and how it's regulated.
Okay.
I'm doing a lot of work on this with clients. I think it does have really, really huge benefits actually, potentially. And it's really about making sure that we can have it used as a tool. And the problem and the thing to flag is the creative sector, and you've got to make sure you have ways that the creative sector can still have copyright and all those things, and that human creativity is still a part of it. But actually there's enormous potential here, and the government's regulation has really, and announcement today has really embraced that.
And we've run out of time for the fun question, which was going to be about Shaun the Sheep, but never mind. Thank you all for joining us. Anne Longfield, Richard Holden, Daisy Cooper and Anita Boateng. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about Cyprus. In 13 years on LBC, I don't think I've done a phone-in on Cyprus. It's an island in the eastern Mediterranean. Many of you will have been there on holiday. There's a big Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot community in the United Kingdom. And it makes me wonder why on earth haven't we talked about this before, because the island is split between the north and the south, which seems very odd when the population of the whole island is only about sort of 1.3 million. So we're going to ask, can Cyprus ever be reunited, or should there be some sort of two-state solution? Really keen to hear from you in this hour. We've got two cracking guests for you as well. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the government has identified 2 RAF sites where thousands of asylum seekers will be housed. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick has been revealing the details of the government's latest plan to deter small boat crossings